Hello and welcome from me, Michael Scott in Oxford in the UK, and from Michael J. Collins from Georgetown University in DC. Welcome to this second season of the Cultural Encounters Books That Have Made a Difference series. It's a series where we are bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary cultural debates. Today, we move away from a literary text in particular, as Dr. Philip Booth will be discussing The Welfare State We're In by James Bartholomew, which was first published in 2004 and has been republished frequently since. Dr. Philip Booth is a distinguished economist. He was educated at the University of Durham and the City University, London. He is currently Professor and Dean of the Faculty of Education, Humanities and Social Sciences at St Mary's University, Twickenham in London. He is also Senior Academic Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. He is the editor of the journal Economic Affairs and Associate Editor of Annals of Actuarial Science and the British Actuarial Journal. And he is a Fellow of the Institute of Actuaries and the Royal Statistical Society. He has published widely throughout his career and was, for a period, a special advisor on financial issues for the Bank of England. He has also been a Fellow at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, I'm pleased to say. If any questions occur to you during this talk, please type them in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Use the Q&A button, please, not the chat one on your computer. Towards the end, I will ask as many questions and be joined by Michael Collins in doing so as possible for our guests to answer. Please don't leave your questions to the last minute, as we may run out of time. With that, I'm looking forward to the talk today. Over to you, Philip.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for the invitation. Maybe I could just say that I haven't been for quite a while a fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I just mentioned that because occasionally it's raised in various contexts, especially as I work now as Director of Policy and Research for the Catholic Bishops' Conference, and I thought it not appropriate to keep on an association with a think tank whilst I did that work. So good morning to those of you in America, good afternoon to those of you in the UK, and good evening to others who may be elsewhere. I've not done one of these presentations before, and neither have I participated in the audience. So I wasn't quite sure what to prepare or what to expect. But I'm going to examine the contribution of a book which I think is interesting. It's interesting and controversial, I should say. But if I were to leap straight to the book, it will probably leave people to divide between those who basically oppose its thesis and those who basically applaud it. And I don't want that to happen. So I want to start by looking at some aspects of Catholic social thought and cultural encounter in the context of the promotion of fraternity before coming to Bartholomew's book. Because I hope that even those who disagree with Bartholomew on certain fundamentals might agree that he does raise some important points that need to be explored. So it's not that I'm looking for a consensus, I'm just hoping that it be appreciated that there is something in what Bartholomew is saying that can help us better understand contemporary problems, especially in the Western world. And by not going directly to the book, I think I can help that process. Now, in recent years, people interested in Christian social thought have begun to express reservations about the welfare state. Concerns have come from the left, for example, Frank Field, a very well-known Labour MP who died, sadly, recently in the UK, and Maurice Glassman, who's a Labour peer and academic. Criticisms have also come from those, as you might expect, who are supportive more generally of a market economy, and also from what are so-called post-liberals, and as well from others who can't easily be categorized. And furthermore, quite interesting questions have been raised by the last three popes about what might be called a welfare mentality. Now, whilst my talk might lean towards a position which would suggest a reduced role for the state in the provision of welfare, that's not my main objective. The important point is that which has been stressed by Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis especially, that we need to ensure that systems of welfare provision really do involve fraternity and a genuinely close relationship between those in need and those who are providing support. Welfare mechanisms, in other words, cannot simply involve the provision of services or money. So whether or not one agrees with the conclusions or the main points in the analysis of the welfare state we're in, and I'll come to that a little later on, it does provide a detailed history of welfare before the welfare state and some of the trends that have come since the welfare state has been developed, largely focusing on the UK. And I think it can help inform some of our discussions about how we can better promote fraternity through the welfare system, together with genuine solidarity and subsidiarity. Although there have been lots of academic papers on this subject, as well as some think tank pamphlets, I think the book by Bartholomew, which was originally published 20 years ago, was the first major book published on that subject, certainly in the last maybe 30 or 40 years. Now, I want to be careful not to claim Catholic social thought and teaching and the teaching of the popes for the anti-welfare state cause. But there's no doubt, in fact, that since the 1960s, Catholic social thought and teaching has been broadly favourable towards the idea of a welfare state. However, other points have been made too in Catholic social teaching, which at the very least should lead us to qualify our support, or perhaps to value important characteristics of the provision of welfare that are not necessarily provided by welfare states. And these points at least should lead us to help maybe understand and have a better discussion about how we can reform welfare states to try to promote the sense of responsibility and the centrality of the family and the characteristics of fraternity that the popes demand. So let's go back to 1991. Back in 1991, for example, John Paul II, in an encyclical letter Centesimus Annus, critiqued the welfare state, writing, "In recent years, the range of such intervention has vastly expanded to the point of creating a new type of state, the so-called welfare state. Excesses and abuses, especially in recent years, have provoked very harsh criticism of the welfare state. Malfunctions and defects in the social assistance state are the result of an inadequate understanding of the tasks proper to the state. By intervening directly and depriving society of its responsibility, the social assistance state leads to a loss of human energies and an inordinate increase of public agencies, which are dominated more by bureaucratic ways of thinking than by concern for serving their clients, and which are accompanied by an enormous increase in spending. In fact, it would appear that needs are best understood and satisfied by those who are closest to them." So here Pope John Paul II is distinguishing between state and society, and maybe that's an important distinction. Maybe we should think more about how to create a welfare society than a welfare state as such. Now, Pope Benedict XVI, in his encyclical letter, Deus Caritas Est, published in 2005, a year after Bartholomew's book, he made a slightly different point. He was not as such suggesting that we should not have a welfare state, or even suggesting that it should be smaller, but he was arguing that provision for the poor demands close personal relationships based on love. And this leads to the question of whether welfare state crowds out, or perhaps if better designed, might be able to crowd in those more intimate forms of support. So Pope Benedict wrote, "The state which would provide everything, absorbing everything into itself," obviously he's using a reductio in absurdum argument there, "would ultimately become a mere bureaucracy, incapable of guaranteeing the very thing which a suffering person, every person, needs, namely loving personal concern. We do not need a state which regulates and controls everything, but a state which, in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity, generously acknowledges and supports initiatives arising from the different social forces and combines spontaneity with closeness to those in need. The Church is one of those living forces, and that was one of the points of the encyclical. She is alive with the love enkindled by the Spirit of Christ. And I think this could all be related to the virtue of solidarity. And as Pope Benedict described that in a later encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, solidarity is first and foremost a sense of responsibility on the part of everyone with regard to everyone, and it cannot therefore be merely delegated to the state. Too much confidence was placed in those institutions as if they were able to deliver the desired objective automatically. So again, he's not criticizing, indeed that the letter criticizes the shrinking of some aspects of the welfare state, but he is arguing that we need something more than a welfare state, and certainly warning us that if a welfare state somehow undermines the bonds of solidarity in society, this may be a problem. Now, sometimes we talk about solidarity and subsidiarity in Catholic social teaching as if they were held in tension. It's argued that solidarity demands action by the state to, for example, support the poor or provide education, but that subsidiarity demands that action takes place at the lowest level possible. I would argue slightly differently. Now, of course, the state should take action where it's appropriate, but it is subsidiarity really which allows an authentic expression of solidarity, because solidarity requires loving personal concern. It can't be done through a bureaucracy. It certainly can't be brought to fulfillment and completion through a bureaucracy, through the delivery of a welfare check or a particular service. And our limitations as human persons make the virtue of solidarity more effective and authentic when we are personally close to those we are trying to assist. So our institution of welfare provision should start with the family and the community. That does not mean that the state doesn't have a role, but there is an essential role for the family and the community. And I think this is compatible already with what Pope Francis has said, both about the welfare state, but more particularly about our own responsibilities in society. For example, Pope Francis has noted welfare projects which meet certain urgent needs should be considered merely temporary responses. He urged his priests to smell the smell of the sheep. In other words, be close to the people, especially in the peripheries that they are trying to serve. I can't find the original quotation, but I'm fairly sure that he critiqued in one of his speeches the idea that the rich should discharge their obligations to the poor simply by sending them checks. We need to have a relationship with the poor. And in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis mentioned what our response should be when migrating persons arrive. And this is not quite on the topic of the welfare state, but I think it summarizes a philosophy which is relevant. Our response to the arrival of migrating persons can be summarized by 4 words: welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. For it's not a case of implementing welfare programs from the top down, but rather undertaking a journey together through these 4 actions in order to build cities and countries that, while preserving their respective cultural and religious identity, are open to differences and know how to promote them in the spirit of human fraternity. And I think that word fraternity is vital. Obviously, that was the topic of Fratelli Tutti. But fraternity is, without fraternity, we don't have proper relationships. I don't think we really have a proper system of caring for those who are less well off than we are, of really understanding their needs, or for that matter, who may be materially better off, but need assistance in other ways. And Pope Francis also talked about two political creeds, which he said dominate our culture, though I think the reality is a bit more complex. He talked about the desire for equality on the left and for individualism promoted by some economic conservatives, as they will be termed in the US, or liberals, who they'd be more correctly, as they will be more correctly termed in continental Europe. He said, and I should say that the Catholic view of liberty, equality, and fraternity is not the same as the French Revolutionary view. That's a picture there is just for illustration. He said that nor is equality achieved by an abstract proclamation that all men and women are equal. Instead, it is the result of the conscious and careful cultivation of fraternity. And that's what people like Frank Field and Maurice Glassman have tried to get across on the left, that there is something problematic about a modern welfare state, which, as we'll see later, transfers huge sums of money, but perhaps undermines the promotion of fraternity. And then, as a warning to those on the other side of the political spectrum, he said, individualism does not make us more free, more equal, and more fraternal. The mere sum of individual interests is not capable of generating a better world for the whole human family. Now, the whole of the of Fratelli Tutti is built on the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I think this illustrates the point quite well. The Good Samaritan had both money as well as loving personal concern, and both of these were necessary, as well also, I should add, of considerable personal bravery. He put himself at great risk in helping out the person who'd been robbed. He gave a check and provided fraternal support. So when thinking of about systems of welfare, we should remember this, that we should endeavour to ensure that nobody is left out, but we should also endeavour to ensure that we understand and meet people's real personal needs. And Pope Francis wrote about this. The parable shows us how a community can be rebuilt by men and women who identify with the vulnerability of others and who reject the creation of a society of exclusion and act instead as neighbours. And of course, the parable of the Good Samaritan does tell us that everybody is our neighbour, lifting up and rehabilitating the fallen for the sake of the common good. And then relating this to the modern world, he says how we can start from below and case by case act as at the most concrete and local levels, and then expand to the farthest reaches of our country with the same care and concern that the Samaritan showed for each of the wounded man's injuries. So we should try and achieve a welfare society, I'll use that term rather than the welfare state, with no gaps. That's what Pope Francis says. We should take it to the furthest reaches of our country and our world. Okay, so that's probably one of the longest introductions you'll ever hear to a topic, but I think it was important. In a sense, the analysis is coming before the presentation of the book, and I think it's useful to do that. So some people who may be listening to this, like Bartholomew, might believe that less state welfare is a prerequisite for more fraternity in welfare. Others on the left, and you can certainly read this into many of Pope Francis's statements as well, might argue that somehow we need to promote a more just, possibly more highly regulated business economy to achieve certain objectives, and that a welfare state that was built on fraternity and contributory principles should complement that. But what the welfare state does, which I think is helpful, is to tell us about how welfare evolved before the welfare state developed, and then also give some indication about, and I have been slightly critical of some aspects of this, give some, in the book, give some indication about how the welfare state has, perhaps causally or perhaps simply coincidentally, gone alongside the diminishment of mutual forms of welfare, the diminishing role of the family in society, and the increased role of a larger and more bureaucratic welfare state. So the author of the book really is trying to get across three messages. There was welfare before the welfare state. He argues that the welfare state had negative effects on saving the family and charity. And he argues that methods of welfare before the welfare state were more fraternal than current methods of providing welfare. I do, and I've discussed this with the author, think that his argument in part is too reductionist. I think he is too quick to draw a causal link in some of the areas he's analysing. He even blames the welfare state on a fall in discipline on the soccer field. And Bartholomew is certainly no soccer expert, and he doesn't realise that, in fact, that discipline in professional football has increased enormously and can't simply be measured by, as the author does, as Bartholomew does, by the number of yellow and red cards, because the hurdles for giving cards have changed dramatically over time. So let's have a quick look at a summary of Bartholomew's book. So what does he cover? Well, he covers the history of welfare before the welfare state. He starts, in fact, well before the Reformation, and describes how the institutions of the church, of course, before the Reformation, the Catholic Church, were responsible for nearly all welfare provision in society before the 16th century, and how that somewhat disintegrated after the Reformation, at least for a while, before it was rebuilt in various other ways. He then talks about how in the 19th century, charity and mutual institutions developed for the provision of welfare. He has some figures in there which are quite interesting about how, for example, charitable giving amongst middle-class families was about 10 times current levels as a proportion of income. He then describes how Lloyd George went to Germany as the sort of undercurrents of national socialist structures were beginning to develop, although predating Hitler, of course, by a few decades, and rather admired what was going on in Germany in terms of the provision of welfare, the Bismarckian reforms, etc. And then he goes into the creation of the welfare state by Beveridge. Now, it is worth pointing out, Bartholomew perhaps underplays this, that Beveridge did believe in a strong contributory principle in the welfare state, and he also believed that private institutions of welfare should be maintained alongside the welfare state. I'll come back to that later. Bartholomew talks about the National Health Service in the UK, which is more or less unique in the Western world, and how before the National Health Service was created, we did have significant healthcare coverage in a mixed system. And I'll come to the pros and cons of that towards the end. In the NHS, in the UK, we have terrible rates internationally of what's called mortality amenable to healthcare. He's very critical of that. He's critical of the low level of doctors, beds, nurses, and so on in the UK system, and the high level of spending on bureaucracy. And it's also perhaps worth noting that we have very high levels of health inequalities in the UK, despite having a health service which is supposedly free at the point of use and uniform across the country. He goes into education in detail and points out how in many areas, most areas in fact, there were maybe 90 to 95% of children in school before compulsory education, and that literacy rates increased dramatically before 1880, when compulsory education was brought in the UK. He talks about the family and the huge increase in tax on poorer families. He mentions that in the 1950s, a family with 2 children on average earnings would pay no tax at all. The state helped families bring up children by lowering their tax burden. I'll come to this a bit later, but we have a tax and welfare system that discriminates strongly against marriage and family formation. And in the UK now, we have 25% of families with children have only one parent at home. Of course, many of these very sad circumstances, but that's a very high figure internationally. And only 63% of children are at home with married parents. And there are long chapters on each of these things, as well as on other issues. including long discussions about how welfare developed before the welfare state. And just to give you a little taster of that, before the welfare state, mutual aid organisations thrived in Britain. In 1910, there were nearly 7 million people who were members of registered friendly societies, over half of adult males. Those societies provided insurance as well as being fraternal organisations. And these figures exclude members of mutual insurance societies, union welfare organisations, which were enormous, and pension schemes. And of course, there will be many people actually, for whom this type of welfare provision was not appropriate. So the very rich, but also agricultural workers, perhaps. And in these organisations were often organised at a local level, and people would actually meet. That was part of the purpose of the friendly societies, and they would know each other personally. So they would know the kind of support that people needed if, for example, they fell into sickness or they became unemployed. They would also know if people were trying to free ride on the system, if they were unemployed but really able to work and being offered employment. And they will be able to adjust the support they provided appropriately. Friendly societies were also really quite effective at providing healthcare by keeping the cost of doctors low, because they were able to negotiate on behalf of their members. And doctors didn't like friendly societies, and were rather pleased when alternative forms of provision came about. They were able to break down what economists call information asymmetries by providing expert support for the members of the society when negotiating with medical professionals. So cheating and shirking was much more difficult because basically you knew the person who was providing you with welfare support. Now, the welfare state evolved differently in different countries, and I'll describe the situation in the UK as it developed in the UK. And at first, the welfare state tried to supplement and complement insurance provision, fill in the gaps, as you might say, and I'll come to that concept right at the end. But even from the beginning, friendly societies were worried about state welfare. And even though state welfare, state pensions, healthcare and sickness provision were at relatively low levels, and there was a conscious effort by the state to try not to undermine the friendly societies and mutual provision. For example, St. Paul's Bennett Street Sunday School Adult Sick and Funeral Society sent a memo to members not long after the creation of the state provision of sickness insurance, stating, "Since the advent of the National Insurance Act, doctors are demanding a much higher fee for their services in connection with sick societies." This goes back to the point I made earlier. And as many of our members are now entitled to the services of doctors under the national scheme, in other words, they were getting free, more expensive services that the Friendly Society charged a small amount for, but provided more cheaply, they may not need the services of the society as hitherto. And then not long after that, the society was wound up. And when Beveridge brought in his reforms, which most people regard as the beginning of the modern welfare state, he did, to give him credit, try to provide a base of basic provision of welfare on which people could build using friendly societies, mutual insurance companies, and so on. But it didn't work out that way because the schemes rapidly expanded to provide income-related benefits, and the poor, of course, no longer needed to have the sort of mutual provision they benefited from before. And so we moved to the position after not many years, whereby today nearly 1/4 of national income is spent on state welfare in the UK, all through state institutions. That's rather unique. In many countries, of course, much welfare spending actually is directed through non-state institutions, such as Christian and Catholic and other independent hospitals and providers of medical care. One thinks of Germany and Holland and so on. But in the UK, essentially, we spend a quarter of the national income on welfare and entirely through state institutions. And I suppose the question I have in my mind, and the question which I think is important for Catholics, whatever your political colour, for the reasons I talked about earlier, is whether we've perhaps thrown the baby out with the bathwater, the baby of fraternity with the bathwater of poverty and gaps in welfare provision. Or, given how prominent we still do have the poor with us, perhaps we've thrown out the baby and kept the bathwater. In other words, kept the problems, many of the problems of pre-welfare state provision, but not actually kept its benefits. So finally, let me move on to some evaluation. So one important question is whether the development of the welfare state has undermined the family. The way we've constructed the welfare state, there are many people, especially the less well off, who are better off living apart from their fathers, from the fathers of their children. In addition, though this is not so true in the US, Germany, or France as it is in the UK, families where one adult stays at home to look after children or older relatives, single earner families, we might call them, are far more heavily taxed than dual earner families. And whether we like it or not, people do respond to financial incentives. In other words, we tax people for staying at home, looking after our own children, looking after our own elderly relatives, etc. And the family is the first unit of solidarity. And the principle of subsidiarity really demands that the state aids the family in its role as the first provider of welfare, rather than penalizes it. And it's within families that we understand both material and non-material needs best. So I think it could be argued that the welfare state, as it's evolved in the UK, a little bit different in other countries, has actually undermined that institution which it ought to be supporting in the provision of welfare. And I should add, by the way, that Beveridge, this was not any of the intention of Beveridge. And by any measure, the decline of the family has been a catastrophe in the Anglo-Saxon world. But just as we value paid work over caring responsibilities in our tax system, I think we can also argue that, rather paradoxically, the welfare state has become transactional and individualistic, words that we normally associate with the market economy. And this is a critique which comes from the left as well. That the intention of the welfare state is to provide all citizens with an amount of income that's believed to be the minimum necessary for a dignified living is not in doubt, as well as providing services such as health and education for everybody. But what this means is that the state effectively says to people, if you cannot look after yourself, the state will provide you with all you need to live independently of others in society. But there may be things that those other people provide or used to provide in those mutual forms of welfare provision, other than material support, which are really quite important and have perhaps been lost and are not easily provided by state services and bureaucracies. And in turn, the state says to the better off, if you discharge your duties by paying taxes, your charity and fraternity can then be a bit part player. This is especially true where the state becomes both a financier of welfare, but also a direct provider, as it is more or less uniquely in the UK health system, or at least more or less uniquely on a monopoly basis. And the idea of a universal basic income, I should add, sort of takes this idea of making people, trying to make people entirely independent of others to an extreme. Now, I spoke at the beginning about the point that recent popes had made about the modern welfare state. So I'm going to end by just noting a couple of points that Leo XIII made in 1891 about the development of the kind of welfare institutions that I've been describing. Now, Leo XIII was somewhat influenced by the English Cardinal Manning, but I think in describing these phenomena, he was thinking much more widely than England or the English-speaking world. I'm sure he would have been. So he said, for example, in the last place, employers and workmen may of themselves effect much in the matter we are treating, in other words, helping the less well off, by means of such associations and organisations as afford opportune aid to those who are in distress. Among these may be enumerated societies for mutual help, various benevolent foundations established by private persons to provide for the workman and for his widow or his orphans in case of sudden calamity, in sickness, and in the event of death, and institutions for the welfare of boys and girls, young people, and those more advanced in years. And he also said how greatly such manifold, he's talking about insurance and mutual aid societies, and earnest activity has benefited the community at large, is too well known to require us to dwell upon it. The state should watch over these societies of citizens banded together in accordance with their rights, but it should not thrust itself into their peculiar concerns and their organisation. For things move and live by the spirit inspiring them, and may be killed by the rough grasp of a hand from without. So the very final point I want to raise is whether or not we can, to use the maybe slightly unfortunate and jaded metaphor I used earlier, can we somehow throw out the bathwater and keep the baby? Can we develop a form of welfare provision where the state does those things that mutual welfare can't do, whilst not undermining the benefits of mutual welfare? Again, I'm trying to look for some potential threads of common interest and perhaps consensus here. The feature of the welfare state, which I think people really want, is security and universal coverage, at least in theory, although I'll repeat that we still seem to have plenty of poverty around. And in many ways, state welfare developed to provide a basic minimum as human dignity demands and to fill in the gaps left by mutual models. That was certainly true of state involvement in education in England, for example. In other countries, there are some different histories. So in Germany, there's a strong relationship between a desire to provide a comprehensive education and ensuring that there was people were fit for the army and that sort of thing. That type of militarism didn't really prevail in the Anglo-Saxon world. Now, if we take health provision before the Second World War, for example, the charitable hospitals, the same names we know today, Great Ormond Street, St Bartholomew's and so on, took in 60% of patients requiring acute care, and local government provided the places for many others. About 19 million people had health insurance, and most of the rest of the population were members of friendly societies or made direct payments. Working men were much better covered than the rest of the population, and there were certainly gaps. There were gaps amongst the poorest, and there were gaps especially amongst women and children. But rather than filling in the gaps, the post-war reforms of health policy in the UK more or less entirely displaced all forms of voluntary, charitable, mutual and commercial provision. In fact, all the church hospitals were nationalised without compensation, except a tiny number of Catholic hospitals. There's a particular history about those, but it was very small in number. And this was unlike, however, what happened in continental Europe, where there remained space for independent provision of healthcare. So perhaps there may be a middle way. But there is always a danger, and we've found this, I think, in education, as well as perhaps in healthcare in continental Europe, that when the state steps in, it seeks to control, regulate, and finance more and more as time goes on. And that is, I think, a real challenge with state provision. How do we help? How does the state fill in the gaps in welfare provision, but at the same time stay within its place, still allowing the principle of subsidiarity to flourish? And when evaluating mutual versus state provision, of course, we should always remember that we shouldn't compare state welfare today with mutual provision in 1900, but whether, given that national income per head is 6 times greater today, whether state welfare does better than mutual provision would have done had it been allowed to flourish as incomes rose. That's a question to which we just don't know the answer. But to return to the point I made at the beginning and to really finish on this, many people from many different perspectives, I think, have increasingly come to believe that we've lost something deeply human about the provision of welfare, partly the undermining of the family, but also this loss of fraternity and the element of contribution which makes people feel part of something rather than merely a client or a recipient of financial aid. I think this is quite widely accepted. I think it's a conclusion that really is compatible with the best of Catholic social thought. And whatever you think about the book as a whole, I do think the welfare state we're in does help us understand that dilemma a little better. Thank you.
Well, Philip, thank you very much for that. I'm sure Michael Collins will be joining us in a moment as well to take on the discussion a little further. Agustin Gonzalez Nunez has already sent a note saying how interesting it was, and she knows the Jesuit Father Rossi, and who's chosen by the Pope, and she feels she can read an intellectual explanation of Pope Francis' approach. So that's terrific. I wonder whether I can just start off with a question about Catholic teaching and the influence here, because in a sense you did start with John Paul II as well, and I wonder whether the Catholic teaching on this area is also influenced by the fear of the communist state that looks after everything. And because of that, and Paul, John Paul in particular, and his relationship, because of that, there's this deep interest.
Yeah. You could argue that Leo XIII, even more so, actually, although he didn't have the same experience. So, no, Leo XIII is a very strong attack, as well as on the behavior of certain of employers and certain pathologies within what was then modern capitalism. There's a very strong attack on socialism as well. And indeed, if you look at some of Pope Pius IX and Pope Leo XIII statements about socialism, which predate the Russian Revolution by several decades, they're remarkably prescient. And so there was this fear of both socialism and secularism on the part of Leo XIII, and I think that comes out in his support for mutual of unions and mutual provision of welfare, which he would have regarded at its best to be Christian mutual provision, and certainly regarded unions as most desirably Christian unions. And John Paul II too. I'm not sure that that's where the critique of the welfare state comes in, because he could have, given the situation in Western Europe at the time, he could have just as easily have sort of said, well, we detest communism for all these reasons, but look what's happening in Western Europe. They've got a big welfare state. People are reasonably well off. Poverty is nothing like it is in the Soviet bloc. So let's sort of have democracy, economic freedom, and a welfare state. So, but he was also influenced, it's said, in the development of that encyclical, at least to some extent, by Michael Novak, and probably to a lesser extent by Friedrich Hayek, as well as the trends you could just see arising in the world, in the Western world at the time.
Fine, thanks for that, Mike. Do you want to?
Yeah, I would. I wonder. I obviously gave a simply an outline of the book and some of the nuance and qualifications and so on. I'm not aware of, since I've never read the book. But it occurred to me while we were talking about the 19th century and the success of private philanthropic or welfare institutions in addressing human needs. I wonder how that squares with Dickens. If you read Dickens, you certainly don't get the sense that these private institutions are maybe in some cases are addressing the needs of a limited number of people. But by and large, the conditions of the poor are absolutely abominable. And I wondered if the writer of the book, Bartholomew, had taken any of Dickens's concerns into
Sure.
consideration.
Yeah. Okay. Now I should say the book is not nuanced. For the purposes of this discussion, I was just sort of wanting to say everybody should be able to get something out of this book, even if they don't like the polemical nature of the book. So the book's not nuanced, even if my talk was. Yeah, there are several.
Understood. Yeah.
Okay.
I understand.
Now, I think there are several responses to that. One is that everybody was just much poorer then. If you go back 100 years to when people were working on the land, or even not that far. So most Catholic, or you could have said 40 years ago that most Catholics in the United Kingdom were there because of the potato famine in Ireland, where a huge proportion of the population literally starved. Much of the population migrated. And it was only a few years ago when the population of Ireland actually reached the level it was before the famine. So I know we look at Dickens and other contemporary accounts of life and think how bad things were, but life was grim. We were going through a process of industrialization, of growing incomes, of reducing poverty, but it's true, of course. Life was grim. I would contest not as grim as it had been in the countryside 40 or 50 years before. But I think another aspect, of course, is that Dickens was right. Obviously, there was much truth in what Dickens was trying to portray, but he was writing literature. And my namesake Charles Booth and Rowntree, of course, did serve as a poverty. So what you're saying is definitely not untrue, but it doesn't mean to say that it was the norm for most people. There was a process of development, and a process of development really which had never happened before. And at that time, a welfare state would not have been able to do much better than mutual institutions, because incomes were so low. You couldn't have taxed people as you do today at 40% of income and created and transferred that income to the poor and expected them to have been much richer. We've carried on through that process of development, and the poor are much poorer. So, as I said right at the end, I think the legitimate question is whether, if we'd allowed these institutions to evolve, they would do better today than the welfare state does today, rather than does the welfare state today do better than those institutions did in the late 19th century. But you're definitely not wrong. These are important and challenging questions.
My historians tell me, and I rely on the historians.
Yeah.
The ones I've read said that if the British government had intervened in Ireland instead of practiced a laissez-faire policy in Ireland, the effects of the potato famine would not have been so dire.
Yeah. Everything else equal, that's true. You could also say if they hadn't had the Corn Laws and so on, then you could argue that in both directions. But yes, no, that's
also the other thing I would wanted to get in, and this is about the United States and not about the UK, is that Ronald Reagan's myth of the welfare queens was thoroughly discredited. Women laying home having children simply so they could increase their welfare payments. That myth that Reagan tried promulgated actually turned out to be simply that, a myth, and not true at all. Not to say there weren't individual instances of that. Yeah.
No, sure, but I think the question there, and I'm sure, you're right. There will be individual instances of people saying, "Well, let's have a baby. The state will support it. We might be able to get a house or whatever." That does happen, but it's not what motivates most people who are poor. I think that the question is whether a tax and welfare system that really does in the UK, I'm not so sure whether it does to the same extent in the US, penalise family formation for the less well-off, contributes to a change in culture and a change in in the risk essentially around having children, getting married, committing yourself, and this type of thing, and what women are willing to ask of men before doing this wonderful thing of producing a child, which requires a great deal of commitment to bring up.
Yeah, that same argument is made in the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yep.
I just wonder on a related area, really, that we now live in a secular society, based on capitalism, and you might get various degrees of capitalism, and the basis at one end you're getting people who are in capitalism who have just got no time for the welfare state whatsoever. Get rid of that. But how do we find a means within a secular society to implement this cultivation of fraternity when the general population has moved away from the values of traditional Christian traditional Christian religion? How do we do that? I mean, it's all very well for us to say, well, the Pope is saying this, and people who have an affinity to the Pope, whether they're Catholics or are linked in another way. Excuse me, I've turned this off. How do we do that? How do we get that kind of integration now in order to be able to do something about that fraternity you talk about? So
yeah. I mean, one important aspect of what happened in the late 19th century was a great growth of religion as well in the United Kingdom. And now, which came first, the chicken? Which came first here? I don't know, because if you read Deus Caritas Est, which I think is a wonderful encyclical, well worth reading, the first, beginning of the I can't remember whether it's the beginning of the first or the beginning of the second section. Talks about how Christians behaved towards each other being something that was partly responsible for the growth of Christianity. And I think we are rediscovering that. We've been through a period in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. Despite all the challenges, most people could see their incomes growing. They could see the possibility of them, or at least their children, owning a house. Yes, of course, there was poverty, but it was quite clear that poverty was reducing really throughout the Western world. And I think maybe Christians in this area, of course, they were doing much, especially in overseas development, but maybe they didn't see their obligations quite as seriously as they had done many, many decades before, and before the welfare state, you could argue. But it's quite whatever has broken down, whether it's too much government interference in the economy, or the breakdown of the family, or some people would say the reduction in the extent of the welfare state doesn't. What the cause is, we could differ on it. It doesn't really matter. Whatever has broken down, there are clearly considerable gaps developing. There are clearly large numbers of poor people, large numbers of people who are not necessarily poor but who are lonely. There are growing numbers of older people. And of course, there's a demographic crisis, which I think is at the root of part of the problems that the welfare state has. If you go back 50 years, you had 6 or 7 working people for every pensioner. Within 20 years, you'll have just over 2 working people for every pensioner. I'm not sure that that's a tenable position. It's a catastrophe. So, and you are seeing a big Christian response, I think, to this growth in poverty, not just material poverty, but other types of poverty as well, which is quite impressive in many ways. So let's hope that also is not a tool of proselytization. Both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis has warned against that. You don't use your charitable work in order to spread the gospel. But a side effect of the charitable work of the church, I think, is actually that people are becoming impressed by the values and get drawn in. So let's hope it does lead to a religious revival as it did in the 19th century. The increasing amount of work that seems to be being done now by Christian churches in the field of welfare.
Thanks for that.
Yep.
They've got some last minute questions coming in. Paul Williams, hello Paul, it's good to hear from you. How well are the churches doing in practice to promote this fraternal approach to welfare? The question prompted by seeing several homeless sleep churching out in wet 50 meters from a warm church in my own town. Yeah. He sees people outside of churches sleeping, not brought into the churches.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I see. Well, I work for the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, so I'm quite close to the Caritas Social Action Network, which is the relevant body which networks Caritas organisations and other Catholic charities in England and Wales, and I see a huge amount happening, including both at the level of charities which might be national or local, but also in individual parishes. Yeah, I mean, it's very sad if there are people sleeping outside a church. I'm not sure what country Paul comes from, but there are many.
From the UK.
He's from the UK. Okay.
Yeah.
But there are certainly many churches that are taking homeless people in one or more nights a week, or maybe throughout the winter. There's my parish priest in Haywards Heath has come from Eastbourne, and the churches got together in Eastbourne and had a project to bring all the homeless people into the church to put a roof over their heads, at least in the winter. And this sort of thing happens quite a lot. And I should say that homeless people are a really good example of people who do need fraternal support. There are some homeless people who become homeless because they can't afford housing, but most homeless people, the vast majority, have quite complex needs. Mental health problems, high proportion sadly discharged from the army. They might have been abused in their home, young people abused from their home and in their home, and they've had to leave home. And it's a really good example of actually where you need a personal relationship to help them with their problems and not just a check. And the government can help provide that. It can help provide support, also including for charities like the Salvation Army, for example, who do that type of thing. So I do see quite a lot of that going on, and obviously it will never be enough.
I'm going to have to bring it to a close in a second, but there's something coming in from Judith Bentley, again, someone who is regularly with us, and Judith says, the talk prompted me to think of hospice movement in the UK, which fills an unmet need, and the concern that has been expressed that more state funding, although desirable, will affect the autonomy they have currently.
That's a really good question. I just say, Augustina is right that demography affected the welfare state too. Might be causal in the other direction too, that the welfare state affected demography. But on the hospice issue, no. I mean, we're talking about assisted suicide in the UK at the moment, and we talk about how the hospice movement needs more support. But there is a concern, yes, if the hospice movement gets more support, and assisted suicide does come in, will the quid pro quo be that the government says, well, you're getting state support, so you have to facilitate assisted suicide, and that will be a catastrophe for the hospice movement. So I think that's a very good question from Judith, and a concern that we should all have. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, very quickly, Mike.
Quick comment. I can't unfortunately put much faith in the Christians, but even including the Roman Catholics, when I see how many of those people, Christians, are supporting Donald Trump, who refuses to recognize that all people are children of God, including the poor and including those who come into the country legally or illegally. So I wish I could have more faith in private institutions and in people's generosity, but I don't see it in the United States.
But then what if Donald Trump is president? Then that creates a dilemma. Do you then have trust in state institutions?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
One institution, one imperfect can't necessarily perfect another.
Dear, dear.
Yeah.
All right. Do you want to? We'll stop. Yes, I'll call you tonight.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I thank you, Philip Booth, for such an interesting and informative session. Next week, on Monday the 28th, we return to a literary book. In fact, one of the oldest literary books, because Jasmine Jones will be discussing Beowulf within this context. Jasmine Jones is an expert in Old English, and if she reads some of the Beowulf in Old English, it'd be beautiful. I've heard her do this before. It is absolutely beautiful. So please don't miss the Jasmine's talk next week. However, if you're in the UK, this is at 3 p.m. next week, because with the UK, the clocks will have gone back, but they won't have gone back in the USA or forward, back or forward. Anyway, they won't have gone back in the USA. So we're actually at 3 p.m. Although if you're in the USA, it's still at 11 a.m. So please remember that for Jasmine Jones. Absolutely a wonderful, wonderful PhD student, just finished or just finishing her PhD. Wonderful student. This Wednesday on the 23rd of October at 4 p.m. UK time, we have a free speech event on neglected crises, neglected wars. This is a talk. We've got a very fine panel talking about the issues of the wars that are not being reported at the moment, and the great suffering that is going on. And so there we are. It's on this Wednesday, 4 p.m. UK time, 11 a.m. US time or Washington time. Please tune in for that. It's part of the free speech series. Thanks to Georgetown University for supporting the series, especially to President Jack DeGioia. We wish him well. He's been ill. We're hoping he's coming through the illness, and we look forward to him getting back to reasonable health. So we wish him well, and we thank him. For Vice President Global Affairs Tom Banchoff, thanks also to Julia Murillo and Mary Gordon. I'd like to thank at Blackfriars Hall Dominic White, our new prior, John O'Connor, the Regent, and Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute, and our new administrator, John Angus Donald Macaulay. So we're grateful to all of them. Also grateful to Maggie, my wife, for the administration help she gives here. I'm Mike Scott from Blackfriars Hall, which is a permanent private hall of the University of Oxford. You can follow me on LinkedIn at Professor Michael Scott, and on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott. I'm no longer on Twitter, which I gather is called X. Anyway, thank you for being with us. And thank you again, Philip, for a fascinating talk. And thank you, Mike, for joining in the discussion. And thank everybody for the questions that have come through. Bye-bye.